Sandeiko and the Ancestors' Gateway. Prologue. If I were to tell you that the magical mysteries of this world are extraordinary only because they remain unknown to the vast majority of its inhabitants, would you believe me? These phenomena are not born of special abilities or divine favor, but simply of knowledge. Knowledge available to all who dare to seek it. Take the words magic and power, for example. To many, they conjure ideas of fiction, illusions crafted to delight or deceive. These are the domains of dreamers, escapists, and performers skilled in sleight of hand. Yet, in the days of old, before the lands were tainted by the poisons that choked the earth and severed the divine connection forged by Nyewo, magic was not an illusion. It was not mysterious. Magic, in its purest form, was communication, a bridge connecting the present to the wisdom of the past and the promise of the future. It was a practice open to all but entrusted to a select few, those bound by responsibility to safeguard the many. It was a thread of life, linking all sparks of existence as one unified plane, accessible through the sacred power bestowed by Ngewo. But time is a merciless adversary. Over generations, the knowledge of this connection faded, calcifying within humanity's core. The spark dimmed, and men forgot the threads that once tethered them to their ancestors. To understand this tale, we must begin at the dawn of time. Ngewo, in infinite wisdom, created this world and many others. Ngewo created the beings suited for this world and placed them in Alkeibulon. He then connected a thread of his intelligence to them for immense knowledge and skill. He also placed beings from other worlds here as guides, to nurture humanity and to share the light and wisdom of Ngewo. But like men, these beings had free will, and so they could reject what was good. They could embrace their flaws instead of pursuing the perfection of Ngewo. These beings from other worlds were called Folos, which meant first, and they used their gifts to build wonders and elevate humanity. However, there were a few, masking their intent, sought only to satisfy their hunger for power and glory. For their transgressions, they were banished to barren dimensions, vast empty voids where life could neither thrive nor endure. It was called Fuana, the place of empty. The time the other beings were allowed on Earth was brief, spanning merely 5 generations. Knowing their limited time here, a chosen few among humanity were taught to awaken the spirit thread portals within themselves. These threads connected them to their ancestors, who had worked hand in hand with the beings in those first generations, and also to Ngewo. The ancestors would become humanity's guides and protectors, once the celestial beings departed. This sacred knowledge was entrusted to a select lineage of history keepers, known as the griots. Through them, the stories of our origins, our triumphs, and our lessons were preserved. The griots were tasked with rekindling the spark of Yawo within humanity, ensuring that the power to shape a better future would never be lost, as the stories of the past, the history of generations, were told and learned from. A great responsibility was held by the griots, and how well they told their ancestor stories, how well they continued to keep record, made some griots even sought after, fought after or coaxed with riches and promises for wealth. It was proven by every generation that the wisdom in the stories of the past have the power to keep the lessons learned in the past from being the mistakes repeated today. Sandeiko and the Ancestral Gateway. Chapter 1, Dry Journey. Our story begins in the ancient land of Alkeibulon, at a time of the day where the sun blazed at its zenith, pouring its unrelenting heat over the desert below. An old man trudged forward, his weathered sandals stirring the parched earth with each deliberate step. The vast expanse of desolation stretched before him, devoid of shade, life, or company. His eyes, sharp despite his years, occasionally deceived him, with faraway scenes just out of reach, imitating the outline of a much desired oasis with huge palms for shade and a cool watering hole. He recognized the mirages for what they were. His earlier travels with Berber guides and Sankor philosophers, skilled in the sciences of the stars and lands, had taught him how the desert bends light to conjure illusions. Yet despite knowing the truth, his parched throat and aching body made him long for the false promises of shade and water. The air was unnervingly still, carrying neither the welcome whisper of a breeze nor the sounds of any living creature, besides the faint, skittering movements of an occasional scorpion. Such silence fed his somber thoughts. He reminded himself not to dwell on memories of past travels, for such reflections often stirred unanswerable questions that distracted from the present. And in the desert, distraction could mean death. A Hansa tree, with its thin, scraggly branches, had occasionally punctuated his path earlier in the day, offering fleeting refuge from the sun. But hours had passed since he last saw one. The oppressive heat pressed against him, soaking through the protective layers of his robe. His face, creased like ancient leather, bore the marks of decades spent wandering such harsh landscapes. A sharp crack underfoot snapped him from his thoughts. He looked down and smiled faintly. His walking stick had struck a scorpion, now lifeless at its tip. A meal for later, he murmured to himself, his voice hoarse. Small victories like this sustained him through the endless trek. His water skin, though precious, was nearly empty. He resisted the temptation to drink deeply, knowing he had to ration what little remained. His destination, a place where water flowed freely and promises of reward awaited, was still far ahead. It had been 2 days since he set out from the safety of his village, and the journey had already pushed his endurance to its limits. The desert was merciless, a place where only the cautious survived. He had rested briefly the previous night under the shelter of a tree, his sleep half wakeful, always alert for thieves, venomous creatures, or prowling beasts. Today the journey had proven particularly grueling. The dunes, which rose and fell like frozen waves, taxed his knees with every step. A faint sound above caught his attention. The harsh cries of carrion birds circling in the distance. He grimaced. Such birds signaled death. Though whether it was man or beast that had fallen, he couldn't be certain. Either way, he quickened his pace, wary of the predators sure to follow those sounds for a meal, that he didn't want to be him. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, the terrain shifted. The rolling dunes gave way to firmer ground, scattered with clusters of stone formations. He spotted an overhang of rocks that offered shade. Relieved, he made his way to the shelter, leaning his back against the rough surface and sliding down to sit on the cooler sand in the shade. For a moment, he allowed himself to rest. The coolness of the shade was a balm to his overheated body. But something strange caught his eye. The rocks seemed to shimmer faintly, emitting an aura of subtle color. He frowned, unsure if the phenomenon was real or the product of his exhaustion. Shaking his head, he rose to his feet. He couldn't afford to linger too long. He needed to find a safe place before nightfall. Hours later, as the day waned and the air cooled slightly, his steps grew heavier. Small grains of sand kicked up by his feet still felt like fire embers against his skin, reminding him of the desert's relentless heat. Though he had spent much of his life as a nomad, accustomed to such harsh conditions, for the first time he began to feel the weight of his years. His thoughts turned to the purpose of his journey. He carried knowledge, information valuable enough to warrant this grueling trek. The promise of grain, enough to last his family through the year, was reward enough to justify the risk. Perhaps there would even be enough coin left over to purchase silks from the traders he'd seen earlier, heading in the opposite direction. Finally, as dusk painted the horizon in hues of orange and violet, his perseverance was rewarded. In the distance, silhouetted against the setting sun, stood the towering structure of the great temple of Tamburo and palace of Alkebalon. Relief coursed through him, giving his weary legs new strength. As he approached the gates of the grand city, a scattering of people lingered outside, travelers, beggars, and those denied entry. He kept his head low, avoiding eye contact. He had no interest in strangers or their troubles. His focus was on meeting his contact and completing his task. Two guards stepped forward as he neared the gates, their postures stiff with suspicion. He raised a hand in greeting, then leaned in to whisper a single word, a code given to him by his contact. The guards exchanged glances, and one disappeared inside, while the other gestured for him to wait. Moments later, the gates creaked open. A tall man stepped out from the shadows, his imposing frame outlined by the torchlight. He approached with deliberate steps, his face obscured by the growing darkness. "You have the information?" the man asked, his voice low and commanding. The traveler nodded, his throat too dry to respond verbally. He reached for his water skin, taking a small sip to wet his mouth before speaking. "Yes, I have what you seek." "Follow me," the man said curtly, turning on his heel. The traveler hesitated for a moment, uneasy about the man's abrupt manner, but he reminded himself of the prize awaiting him. Silently, he followed the man past the gates and into the depths of the city, disappearing into its labyrinth of narrow alleys and shadowed corridors. As the old man followed his guide through the city gates, the noise of bustling activity began to fade, replaced by an eerie stillness. The streets were narrow, lined with circular mud brick dwellings, called mutabans. These were the shops and the dwellings of all those who served the Mansa and met the needs of the palace. They were all so close together they almost seemed connected. The outer walls of the dwellings were faintly lit by torches mounted in iron sconces, so as to light the path they followed on those narrow streets. Shadows danced on the walls, flickering like restless spirits. The tall man walked briskly, his broad shoulders cutting through the gloom with practiced ease. The traveler struggled to keep pace, his exhaustion weighing heavily on his limbs. Every few steps, he glanced over his shoulder, a habit ingrained by years of vigilance. The city's silence unnerved him. The two turned into an alley, where the tall man stopped abruptly in front of a doorway barely visible in the dim light. With a single glance to ensure they were alone, he opened the door and motioned for the traveler to enter. Inside, the room was small and sparsely furnished, with walls of rough and hardened brick, and a single wooden table in the center. A faint, acrid smell hung in the air, like burning herbs. The traveler hesitated at the threshold, his instincts urging caution. "It is safe here," the tall man said, his tone a command rather than reassurance. Reluctantly, the traveler stepped inside. The tall man closed the door behind them and gestured toward a chair by the table. "Sit," he said. The traveler obeyed, lowering himself into the chair with a groan as his weary body protested. He set his walking stick across his lap, his fingers tightening briefly around it, as if for comfort. The tall man leaned against the wall, his arms crossed. His face, now visible in the dim torchlight, was rugged and stern, with a jagged scar running from his left temple to his jaw. His piercing gaze seemed to study the traveler, as though weighing his every movement. "You have traveled far," the tall man said. The traveler nodded. "Farther than I care to admit," he replied, his voice hoarse. He lifted his water skin and took another small sip, wetting his throat. "I hope the journey was worth it." "That depends," the tall man said, his eyes narrowing. "Tell me what you know." The traveler set the water skin aside and reached into the folds of his robe, pulling out a small leather pouch. He placed it on the table and slid it toward the tall man. "This contains the information you requested," he said. "A map and marked pieces of jewelry to demonstrate their artist's craft. It's all there." The tall man didn't move. "Tell me what you saw and what you heard." The traveler hesitated, glancing at the pouch as though it might speak for him. "It was as your spy described," he began. "The griot in Tukindo is unlike any I've ever encountered. His words, his stories, they are alive. The villagers say he can summon Nayama in ways no one has seen for generations, and I have seen it myself." The tall man's expression remained unreadable, but his posture shifted slightly, as if the words had piqued his interest. "They call him Bala," the traveler continued. "He inspires the hunters with tales of bravery, and they return with more game than the village needs, so that their storehouse is filled with the dried meat for trade. The women create intricate works, baskets, tapestries, even meals, guided by his words. It is as though he brings the past to life, weaving it into their present." "And what of the stories of his origins?" the tall man asked, his voice low. The traveler hesitated again. "There are whispers. They say he is older than the trees, that he was once a tree himself, watching over the battles of our ancestors. The villagers believe he transformed into a man to carry those stories forward. Myth, perhaps, but the reverence they hold for him is real." The tall man pushed himself away from the wall and approached the table. He picked up the pouch, weighing it in his hand. "And his connection to Nayama, is it true?" The traveler nodded. "It is said he can summon it with a single movement of his hand. I have seen it with my own eyes." The tall man opened the pouch and withdrew a small roll of parchment. He unrolled it on the table, revealing a map marked with symbols and annotations. His eyes scanned the details quickly, his brow furrowing in concentration. "This griot," the tall man said, his tone measured. "He could be a great asset to the kingdom, or a dangerous adversary." The traveler said nothing, his gaze fixed on the table. The tall man rolled up the parchment and returned it to the pouch. He pulled a small sack from his belt and placed it on the table. The clinking sound of coins inside broke the heavy silence. "For your efforts," he said. The traveler reached for the sack, his fingers trembling slightly. "And my part is done?" "For now," the tall man replied. "You've earned your rest, but if your information proves false, I will find you." The traveler nodded, his throat tight. He stood slowly, slipping the sack of coins into his robe. Without another word, he turned and left the room, his footsteps echoing down the narrow alleyway. The tall man remained behind, staring at the closed door. His thoughts churned with the possibilities this new information presented. Bala, the griot of Tudkindo, was no ordinary storyteller. If the rumors were true, he held power that could shape the fate of the kingdom, or destroy it. As the tall man extinguished the torch and stepped into the night, his purpose was clear. He would deliver this information to the Mansa, and together they would decide how to wield the power of the griot.